Welcome back to History Recapped. Today we take on one of the longest and most divisive wars of the 20th century, the Vietnam War. It was a conflict born out of colonialism, hardened by Cold War rivalries, fought in jungles and rice paddies, and waged on the television screens of millions of homes around the world. For the people of Vietnam, it was a struggle for independence and unification. For the United States, it was part of a global mission to contain communism. And for the wider world, it became a symbol of both resistance and tragedy. This episode will take you through the entire story, from Vietnam's colonial past under France to the final helicopter evacuations from the roof of the US Embassy in Saigon. Along the way, we'll explore the battlefield strategies, the politics, the protests, the propaganda, and the human cost that defined this war. Vietnam's story before the American War is one of foreign domination. For centuries, it endured invasions from China. In the 19th century, it became part of French Indochina, a colony that also included Laos and Cambodia. The French invested in infrastructure, but largely to extract resources, rubber, coal, rice, and to enrich French companies. Vietnamese farmers were heavily taxed, while French settlers and local elites reaped the benefits. A generation of Vietnamese intellectuals began to question this system. Among them was Nguyen Sinh Cung, who would later be known as Ho Chi Minh. After traveling the world as a young man, Ho absorbed revolutionary ideas, joining socialist circles in Paris and even studying in Moscow. He became convinced that Vietnam's independence could only come through revolution, combining nationalism with communism. The Second World War upended Asia. Japan invaded French Indochina, but the French colonial administration remained in place, collaborating with Tokyo. During this period, Ho Chi Minh founded the Viet Minh, a resistance movement. The Viet Minh fought both the Japanese and the French, gaining support from peasants by redistributing land and positioning themselves as champions of independence. By 1945, with Japan's surrender, Ho seized the moment. On September 2, 1945, he declared Vietnam's independence in Hanoi, borrowing lines from Thomas Jefferson. "All men are created equal." The crowd erupted with hope, but the Western powers had other plans. France wanted to reclaim its colony. The United States, despite its own anti-colonial origins, supported the French in the early stages of the Cold War, seeing Ho not as a nationalist but as a communist ally of Moscow and Beijing. The First Indochina War erupted in 1946. French forces relied on superior weapons and air power, but the Viet Minh fought with determination, using guerrilla tactics, knowledge of the terrain, and the support of local villages. By the early 1950s, the war had become a drain on France. At the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, General Vo Nguyen Giap surrounded the French garrison in a valley. In a feat of endurance, his forces hauled artillery through jungle and mountains, placing them in commanding positions. After weeks of shelling and relentless assault, the French were crushed. It was the first time a colonial power had been defeated in such a manner in the 20th century. The Geneva Accords soon followed, dividing Vietnam at the 17th parallel into a communist north under Ho Chi Minh and a south led by Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic nationalist supported by the US. The agreement called for nationwide elections in 1956, but those elections never happened. Ngo Dinh Diem, backed by American advisors and aid, built a government in Saigon, but Diem quickly alienated much of the population. His favoritism toward Catholics angered the Buddhist majority, while his refusal to enact land reform frustrated peasants. His security forces cracked down on dissent, imprisoning and torturing suspected communists. The Viet Cong, the communist insurgents in the south, gained strength. They assassinated officials, distributed propaganda, and promised land to peasants. Villages became contested zones. In 1963, Diem's repression of Buddhists sparked mass protests. The self-immolation of monk Thich Quang Duc shocked the world. Photographs of his burning body became a global symbol of resistance. The US, frustrated with Diem's failures, supported a coup. Diem was overthrown and assassinated, plunging South Vietnam into instability with a revolving door of military juntas. By the early 1960s, the US was already heavily involved, sending advisors and equipment. Under President Kennedy, American special forces and helicopters were deployed, but it was under President Lyndon B. Johnson that America fully committed. In August 1964, reports emerged that the USS Maddox had been attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The details remain controversial. Historians argue that the second reported attack may never have happened. Still, Johnson seized the moment. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving the president broad powers to wage war without a formal declaration. American troops soon poured into Vietnam. In March 1965, U.S. Marines landed at Da Nang. Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign against the North, began. Johnson promised quick victory. Instead, America was drawn into a quagmire. The U.S. military entered with overwhelming firepower, believing its superior technology would prevail. But the war in Vietnam was unlike anything they had faced. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, traps, snipers, and tunnels. The Cu Chi tunnels outside Saigon stretched for hundreds of miles, serving as bases, supply routes, and hiding places. U.S. soldiers, meanwhile, were tasked with search and destroy missions, scouring villages for Viet Cong. Too often, these missions led to civilian casualties, destroying trust and fueling resentment. Napalm, gelid gasoline that burned everything in its path, was dropped on villages. Agent Orange, a defoliant, meant to strip the jungle of cover, poison soil, water, and people. Generations would suffer birth defects and illnesses as a result. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, running through Laos and Cambodia, supplied the Viet Cong despite constant U.S. bombing. No matter how many tons of explosives were dropped, the trail was repaired overnight by workers with bicycles and shovels. American commanders measured progress by body counts, boasting of kill ratios. But for every Viet Cong soldier killed, another seemed to take their place. In January 1968, during the Lunar New Year holiday of Tet, the Communists launched a surprise offensive. Tens of thousands of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops struck cities and towns across South Vietnam, even storming the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, the offensive was costly for the Communists. They suffered huge losses and failed to hold their gains. But politically, Tet was devastating for the U.S. public opinion, already wavering, collapsed. Americans watching nightly news broadcasts saw that the war was far from over. Johnson's assurances of progress were shattered. The image of South Vietnamese police chief Nguyen Ngoc Loan executing a Viet Cong prisoner in the streets of Saigon became one of the most infamous photographs of the war. Johnson announced he would not run for re-election. The credibility of America's war effort was gone. Back in the United States, the war tore the nation apart. Protest movements grew louder. Students marched, veterans spoke out, and musicians wrote songs condemning the conflict. Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Creedence Clearwater Revival gave the anti-war movement anthems. The draft was deeply unpopular. Poor and working-class men were disproportionately sent to fight, while many wealthier Americans found ways to avoid service. Protests turned deadly at Kent State University in 1970, when National Guard troops opened fire on students, killing 4. The release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 revealed that successive administrations had misled the public about the war's progress and goals. Trust in government collapsed. Richard Nixon entered the White House in 1969 promising peace with honor. His strategy, called Vietnamization, was to withdraw U.S. troops while strengthening South Vietnam's army. But Nixon also escalated the war in secret, bombing Cambodia and Laos to destroy sanctuaries along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These campaigns destabilized Cambodia, paving the way for the Khmer Rouge, one of history's most brutal regimes. The expansion of the war fueled further protests in America. Despite withdrawals, U.S. air power continued. In 1972, Nixon unleashed the Christmas bombings on Hanoi and Haiphong, forcing North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The U.S. agreed to withdraw all forces, while North Vietnam promised not to invade the South. But the accords were fragile. U.S. troops went home, but fighting continued. South Vietnam's army was ill-prepared to fight alone, and corruption sapped morale. By 1975, North Vietnam launched a final offensive. The South collapsed in weeks. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The South Vietnamese government surrendered. Images of desperate people clinging to helicopters, evacuating from the U.S. Embassy roof, became iconic symbols of America's defeat. Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. The cost was immense. Around 3 million Vietnamese died, along with over 58,000 Americans. Cambodia and Laos suffered years of bombing, upheaval and genocide. The environment of Vietnam was scarred by chemicals and bombs. For the US, the war left deep scars. Returning veterans often faced hostility or indifference, struggling with trauma. The war shook Americans' faith in their leaders and contributed to what became known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a reluctance to commit US forces abroad. For Vietnam, reunification brought independence but also years of poverty and isolation. Only in later decades would the country rebuild and open itself to the world. The Vietnam War was a tragedy of epic proportions. It was a war of liberation, a Cold War battleground, and a lesson in the limits of military power. It showed how ideology and politics can blind leaders to reality, and how ordinary people bear the cost of decisions made far above them. Today, the war stands as both a symbol of resistance and a warning about the dangers of intervention. It remains one of the most studied, debated, and remembered conflicts of modern history. This has been History Recapped. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Vietnam War, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And as always, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep history alive.